Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to go into topic 4.6. This is internal and external challenges to state power from 1450 to 1750. So the majority of today we're going to talk about internal challenges more than external challenges, even though they do exist. The examples that are given to College Board from College Board of this time period is something we've already covered in previous topics, and you'll recall them, and I'll also make a note in the PowerPoint of where you can find these if you need to brush up on them again. But the essential question today is, how did the development of new empires result in internal challenges in the period of 1450 to 1750? So our basic context today, we're talking about new empires have been growing and growing across the world. It's not just the maritime empires, it's also land-based empires as well. And as these empires grow, they become more powerful. There is going to be some resistance to that power and some resistance to people's place within those empires as well. So there are going to be various degrees of how that resistance looks like, all the way from being passively resistant to more of an aggressive, open, violent resistance within these states themselves. So we're talking about challenges to state power. Here's our wonderful Benjamin Freemanpedia graphic of different examples, and some of these we're going to be talking about a little bit in this lecture today. So we're talking internal and external challenges. We're going to start about state expansion and centralization led to the resistance from an array of social, political, and economic groups on the local level. So here are examples here, and that we're going to be going through. These are the ones that College Board wants us to cover. And so we're going to go through them individually very quickly. I'm also going to link some videos to the Canvas page that are really good at describing what's going on with these. And I highly encourage you to go through them. That's why I'm going to try to make this one short so that you have more time to go through and learn about the different, challenges to state power, these different revolts and so forth. Okay, so let's start with the Pueblo revolts, also known as Pope's uprising. So Pope was a Native American. He's living within the Spanish Empire, and the Pueblo people had been, basically colonized by the Spanish. Of course, the Spanish bring missionaries with them, and as a result, they are converting them to Native American to Catholicism, and things aren't going so great for the Pueblo people after the arrival of the Europeans. I mean, the disease, they're under the Spanish control. The missions and the missionaries that are coming are definitely very aggressive when it comes to trying to coerce Native Americans into slavery, essentially, as well as, converting to a religion that many of them are becoming less and less faithful of. So in 1680, the Native Americans that were living there, led by Pope, are going to rebel, and they are going to win and kick out the Spanish for a time. And roughly, 400 Spaniards are killed in this uprising. The Spanish leave for a time and don't come back for a while because of this rebellion. So it is successful in the short term. In the long term, it's more arguable that ultimately the Spanish and the Europeans win out. But this is a good example about sometimes, a lot of people view history from this perspective that people have history forced upon them, and they don't, remember that there are people who are actively trying to create their own path in the history, and Pope is a good example of that. The Fronde is a rebellion that occurs within France. So France is becoming more and more powerful as a country, and as that power grows, it becomes more centralized within the monarchy of France. And so the idea of absolute monarchy that is really coined within King Louis XIV's reign, they are going to, there is going to be resistance to this idea of a one centralized ruler. And so the Fronde, was made up of rebellions against the monarchy, against this idea of absolute monarchy. And it's led mainly by people who got a lot of skin in the game. So like your general lords who are, seeing their power dwindle within their own lands to this monarchy. And so this is going to ultimately lead to, the King Louis XIV will win, and it will lead to him, forcing his lords and the people who are supposed to be loyal to him to move to Paris so he can keep them under their watchful eye. And then, of course, he builds the Versailles, the giant palace within it, and then he can keep the families of these lords and themselves within kind of shouting distance if there's ever any issues. So very similar to what we saw with Peter the Great in Russia, the idea of building this gigantic palace so that you can keep your friends and maybe your enemies close, So the Cossack rebellions, and there's going to be a great video that's going to be linked to this about the Cossacks. But the Cossacks were basically a warrior tribe that lived within the Empire of Russia. And they're very, very successful warriors. And they are going to resist against Russian rule, the monarch's rule. And they are going to lead a series of rebellions, lots of rebellions, over the course of history within Russia. They originate from Poland, but they're nomadic people, so they travel, they move around a lot. But between the 16th and 17th or 18th centuries, you have three major rebellions that occur of the Cossacks themselves, and they are going to, even frequently raid the Ottoman Empire that had extended into Eastern Europe itself. But the Cossacks are going to be something that I highly encourage you to read the Freemanpedia illustrative example video, because he does a great job of talking about that and going to an example with much better production value than what I'm providing here for you. Okay. The Marathas Conflict with the Mughals. This is another video that Ben Freeman has put together that I'm going to highly encourage you guys to watch. But the Marathas are a caste of Hindus who live within India under the Mughal Empire. And there is going to be resistance to being ruled by the Mughals. And so you have these pockets of resistance. So the Maratha kingdoms are going to fight against the Mughal sultans over the course of this time period, all the way into the 19th century. That are going to carve out like little pockets of power in which it's going to be a Hindu led kingdom rather than the Mughals who are going to fight against that. So the Marathas, then their resistance probably were one big reason why the Mughals eventually collapsed, because this internal conflict and the resources they put to trying to put these conflicts down and these rebellions down ultimately weakens the Mughal Empire to where the British will be arriving and then take over the rest of South Asia and India. So that's something that is well represented and brought up within Ben Freeman's Freemanpedia video. So those are two videos I highly, highly, highly encourage you guys to watch. All right, Anna Nzinga, who was the queen of modern-day Angola, and so she's going to fight a series of rebellions against the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, of course, are arriving, and they are coming to Africa, and clearly we probably already know what is the Portuguese trying to get the most of, and that's slaves. And so she is going to lead a series or a rebellion against the Portuguese. And this is all in turn to kind of help the slaves escape being coerced into labor against their will. And so she helps a lot of them flee to the more internal parts of Africa, where it would be harder for them to be culled and then brought across the Middle Passages into the New World. There's a little comic strip put by UNESCO that I have linked onto this page that I highly encourage you guys to read as well. It does a much better job of kind of what her story is and what she did in the time that she was alive. Another one's Metacom's War, and sometimes, especially when we talk about in U.S. history, this is known as King Philip's War. The Metacom himself was a Wampanoag leader who is going to be called Philip by the English, and the Pilgrims who settled in New England. So the English they're pushing inwards. They're starting to colonize and take land and cut down trees and make it farmland further inland away from the coast, and they are going into territory that was, of course, once dominated by the Native American people. And so, as this land continues to be taken away from the Native Americans, there's going to be that resistance to it. So Metacom's War was essentially the last major conflict that occurs within New England over the use of the land. And so the war itself is going to be very destructive on both the British and the indigenous population side. And ultimately, King Philip's War, Metacom's War, is going to be lost by the Native Americans. The big reasons for this would be the introduction of gunpowder weapons, and the English just had way more gunpowder weapons to be able to fight. So it is a good example of resistance against this. I mean, it's not like, I don't want to give everyone the impression that the Europeans just arrived and then just took the land because it was available. There were people who still lived there, despite being devastated by the diseases of smallpox and others. They still were enough alive that were trying to resist against having their lands and their homelands taken from them. And Metacom's War is a good example of that. It's same with the Popey's rebellion. So there's also challenges to slavery. As slaves will resist being enslaved, and it's not a surprise to anybody. Nobody wants to be enslaved. But there are some examples of where, we have large-scale resistance against slavery, and there's small-scale too. There are a lot of people who were enslaved that resisted against slavery by, working slower, just kind of making it so that they're not very valuable laborers, okay? But there's also the ones who would run away, and the ones who would fight back at times as well. And so, we're going to talk about a couple examples here. Let's start with the Maroon Society. So Maroons were, runaway slaves who made their way into the internal jungles of some of the islands in the Caribbean and Brazil. Some of them found their way into remote areas that were surrounded by swamps. That made it easy for them to hide away from people who were hunting them, old slave owners, things, people like that, right? So the Maroon societies that come about become kind of these semi-stable communities within these areas of the Caribbean and Brazil. One good example was a Maroon society in Jamaica that was run by a woman who became known as Queen Nanny. And she oversaw the protection and the stability of that Maroon society, where they had people who went out and tried to capture and free more slaves. They had people who were hunting and fishing. They had people who were building homes, and so they had this nice little community of freed slaves who had run away. And so, that's just a good example of the Maroons and what they did and how that looked. We also have a lot of North American slave resistance as well within the British colonies. And so even though the Latin American colonies is where you have the majority of the slaves that are going to, North America still has plenty of slaves that are making up the populations within, especially the southern colonies. But, like I mentioned, there's passive resistance and such. They would escape. They would break their tools. They would slow down work. Those are just small passive ways of resisting. But there's also some who ran away as well. And so one example would be the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons that were found in Western Virginia and North Carolina. And so because the swamps themselves were very hard to navigate, once you knew how to get in and out of them, it was easy to hide out within them, away from, soldiers and people who were riding in horses, which gave them a distinct advantage. But once you knew the land like they did, they were able to hide out in the swamps and, not be slaves. Another good example is the Stono Rebellion. This was the largest of the rebellions, slave rebellions that occurred in the British colonies. There'll be other slave rebellions within the United States when it becomes a state itself. But the Stono Rebellion itself was on the British mainland colonies, and roughly 25 colonists were killed in this slave uprising. I'm going to try to link a video to this. I'm not sure if it will work, though. But there are 35 to 50 Americans that were killed in this rebellion as well. Ultimately, it does get put down as the state power does send soldiers and call up this militia to help put down this rebellion. But it is a good example of resistance to slavery, right? Some also important things that are mentioned in the curriculum. This is the 30 Years' War in Europe and the Ottoman-Safavid conflict. And rather than me talking about them again, I just encourage you, if you need a refresher, go back to topics 3.3. It would probably be towards the end or the middle and the end of that video. I feel like I've already done a decent enough job to kind of describe what the 30 Years' War was about and the state rivalry that was between the Protestant and the Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottoman-Safavid conflict is largely linked to that whole religious war, but it's over borders, it's over trade, but the underlying cause of that is the Safavid Shiites who are fighting against the Sunni Ottoman Empire, right? But that's that, okay? So just going back to the beginning here, essential question, how did the development of new empires result in internal challenges in the period of 1450 to 1750? So go ahead and make sure that you also check out the videos that are linked onto this Canvas page. But other than that, this is Mr. Henry signing off.